Good afternoon, Mr Speaker, and thank you very much for that. I'm very proud to take a call on the Vulnerable Children's Bill. It's one of the reasons that I got into the professional work that I was doing, because I acknowledge that in many aspects of our work, the voice of children fails to be heard, and in this regard, having a Vulnerable Children's Bill means that the voice of children should well and truly be heard today. And I want to acknowledge the thousands of submissions that have been made during this process over the course of the years that this piece of legislation has traversed, which started with the Green Paper for Vulnerable Children, went to the White Paper for Vulnerable Children. Various pieces of work fell out of that: the Children's Action Plan, the development of the children's teams, and here we are today in the third reading of the Vulnerable Children's Bill. So I want to acknowledge the significant piece of work that communities, that social workers, that legislators, that everyone has done to bring this bill to this day. But I do want to add my note of disappointment that despite those thousands of submissions, despite all the thousands of hours that went into the crafting of much of the work that the community submitted on, some of that hasn't made it to the bill. There are some aspects that have, and I want to acknowledge that, but there are many things that we have not found in this bill which will not go far enough to protect the children of New Zealand. I want to go back to what I believe was the genesis of this bill, because I really appreciate the Minister was trying to curb what has become a national disgrace in terms of our child abuse statistics, and that is the case of Child M in West Auckland. And Child M, some of you may recall that case where that poor child was the subject of torture at the hands of her parents. And one of the significant aspects in the reporting of that particular case was the failure of those services who were engaged to work with that family to actually communicate with each other. And I wonder about the lessons of that case that have not been learnt and have not found their way into this bill. When I was working for a family violence service, we had a picture of Minister Bennett on the wall. She had been interviewed by the New Zealand Herald some years ago, really talking about what she wanted to do to protect our children. That picture sat alongside some of the other pictures of children who had been abused, such as the one that the member Melissa Lee talks about near Glassy. Pictures of James Whakaruru, who I use as my personal touchstone in my work, and the Kahui twins. What I would like to say today is, will this bill have protected those children? Will it have prevented what happened to those children? In the case of Child M, where one of the most overriding issues was the lack of communication between those social services and government agencies, will this bill go far enough to protect that child? And I doubt that it does. Will this bill go far enough to have prevented what happened to the Kahui twins? It's possible under the provisions relating to subsequent children. Will it go far enough to protect what happened to James Whakaruru? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. What this bill doesn't contain are things like the positive aspects of parenting, supporting parents to be good parents, simple things like promoting attachment and bonding. And when you have young parents, this is a process that needs extra support and help. Does it include positive parenting programs for struggling parents? I don't think it does. Does it address what the chief social worker terms as the unholy trinity when it comes to vulnerable children: parents with mental health, problematic substance abuse and family violence? I'm afraid it doesn't. So the chief social worker talks about what he terms the determinants of the most vulnerable children, and this bill fails to acknowledge that. I want to I was listening to some of the other speakers, and the Minister herself talks about the collaboration between the CEOs, the accountability that they will have in addressing it over a range of ministries, which is great. I applaud that. But it's not the first time it's happened. We had a national task force on sexual violence prevention that was put together by a Labour government, the last Labour government, which this government disbanded. So I just want to remind the Minister that that was a good process. That was a good process. The Minister in recent days has been talking about how much has been put into sexual violence abuse prevention. 10.4 million, I think, over the next 4 years. What I want to say is those programs were in place, they were not well supported. The result is that we have to put in place legislation like this to support our most vulnerable children. There is another issue that I want to raise, and that is in terms of legislation that has unintended consequences. And I refer to a comment that I think my colleague Lewis Awall made about the numbers of arrests declining in terms of family violence. There was, in 2011, changes to the Solicitor General's guidelines on arrests. What that meant was there was a higher threshold required before an arrest could be made, and the threshold was around whether it was likely that a charge could then result in a conviction. So the police had to make a determination on whether it was likely the situation they were seeing before them could result in a conviction in a court of law. That had a huge impact on family violence statistics. It was an unintended consequence, but it meant that less men were arrested in family violence, domestic violence call-outs. The unintended consequence is that less arrests means less men were being compelled to attend family violence anger management programs. So less men supported to deal with their anger. One of the key indicators, as determined by the Chief Social Worker to prevent harm to children, and by a matter of unintended consequence, we have less men being supported to deal with their anger. What I think we should have done, thank you, Mr. Speaker, what I think we should have done is looked at having a much more positive approach to our children. Why are we targeting such a small group of vulnerable children when there are at least 285,000 children living in poverty? And yes, I understand the rhetoric. Poverty is not an excuse, but as my colleague behind me says, it is an explanation. When one of the determinants of safety in a child's life is the level of income and resource that goes into that child's household, then we must recognise that poverty is a key driver of safety for children. Why are we not looking at making positive changes to these families' lives? Warm, dry, affordable homes where kids are not getting sick, children that can be well fed and well supported so they're not going to school hungry and unable to learn, programs that actually support all kids, and real measures in place to address the 285,000 children living in poverty so that they can reach their potential. I want to say I commend the Minister on starting this journey. This journey has not gone far enough, and I would recommend that this journey continue so that we can do more to keep our children safe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mike Sabin.
Oh, thank you, sir. A very good speech. Shame it was bereft of fact.
What it was interesting that the member